privacy is a right in and of itself, but also a gateway right for all of the other charter-protected rights. It's also not fair to ask people to take on that huge burden when the onus should be on the companies and organizations that want our information for their own purposes. Using the technology increases the level of intrusion into their lives by virtue of being subject to more surveillance than other people. So my name is Brenda McPhail. I am the director of the Privacy, Technology and Surveillance Program. And the CCLA is a rights and freedoms watchdog organization. We've been around for more than 50 years, defending rights and freedoms of people across Canada, and we do that through legal advocacy, through policy advocacy, and public education. So increasingly, we understand, as people who care about rights in our organization, that privacy is a right in and of itself, but also a gateway right for all of the other charter-protected rights that we stand up for. If you don't have privacy, you're possibly less likely to speak up freely to exercise your right to free expression, particularly if you have opinions that are controversial, perhaps, or that go against, current thinking, whether it's, political, academic, or in your workplace. And if you feel you're being monitored and particularly recorded while you say those things, you're even less likely to say them. It affects our freedom of assembly rights, particularly around assembly for political purposes like protest. Because there's actually good qualitative data to suggest that if people think they're going to be filmed at a protest by police, they may be less likely to go and stand in solidarity with those who are expressing opinions that they themselves believe. But it has the potential to chill their willingness to go out and stand up for issues. And it's an equality. Increasingly, privacy is a gateway to equality, both because we've got all kinds of new and exciting surveillance technologies that want to affect your behavior by knowing who you are, but also want to potentially affect the products and services and entitlements that you're offered based on who you are. And sometimes that process can be very fundamentally discriminatory. So that portfolio is one that sits in the middle of the organization. I do a lot of work. We have program directors for equality, for criminal justice, for fundamental freedoms, including particularly freedom of expression and assembly. And I work with all of my colleagues on issues where there's juxtapositions, where technology is impacting the way that people have the options of exercising their rights and freedoms.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for that background and overview. And so today we're meeting to talk about, in particularly, facial recognition. So what is a way for someone to think about the trade-offs between technology-driven convenience and our personal privacy? And in your opinion, do you think that people think about this as much as they should?
People probably don't think about this as much as they should, given the current ways of the technological world. But it's also not fair to ask people to take on that huge burden when the onus should be on the companies and organizations that want our information for their own purposes. So people absolutely do need to inform themselves, make themselves more aware of what happens. But really there should be a stronger onus that we place on the people who want to use the information, not the people who are being asked to provide it. In terms of how to think about the trade-off between technology-driven convenience and personal privacy, it is the position of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association that privacy is a fundamental human right. Rights aren't something that we should be asked to barter away, and it's a fundamental flaw in the way that sort of the capitalist system, surveillance capitalistic system on the internet has evolved, that we are increasingly being asked to make those kinds of choices. And in Canada, we have privacy laws, particularly our private sector privacy law, that is explicitly framed as a law that tries to balance commercial interests with privacy interests, rather than recognizing that privacy is a right, and information uses should only be allowed to the extent that they are necessary or proportionate or consensual, while still allowing individuals to protect that right. So we've got sort of an economic system that has evolved in ways that encourage us to think of privacy as a convenience we can trade away, and we have laws that don't explicitly remind us that our right to privacy is in fact just that, a right that we shouldn't be asked to trade away. Certainly not without, full and informed understanding of what we're getting into, and an explanation of the benefit, if any, to us, or a larger social benefit to the exchange of information. So, in a shorter way of how should we think about trade-offs is we shouldn't have to make them. This is one of those really rare situations where we should be able to have our cake and eat it too.
If facial recognition then is the technology that generates the ones and zeros in the form of video or photographic data, and this feeds facial analytics, which is what happens to these ones and zeros, then why should we be just as concerned about facial analytics as we are intrigued by facial recognition technology? And what are some examples of facial analytics that appear in our everyday lives?
I would alter the question just a teeny bit in that facial analytics are one end of a spectrum of facial recognition. So it's not just that facial recognition is the technology and facial analytics is what happens with the technology. Rather, the technology is one that makes a biometric out of our face. It creates a numerical map of our face, and it uses that to create a template, a biometric template, that can then be compared against other photos. And you can use those templates for a range of activities, all the way starting with facial analytics. So based on your template, are you a man or are you a woman? Are you young or are you old? Are you black or are you white? Or are you Asian? Or are you something else? Are you Indigenous? At the other end of the spectrum is full-on recognition. And in that case, the template can be compared to a template that's derived from another photo of you where your identification is known. Something like a driver's license database. Those photos are all facial recognition enabled in order to perform a one-on-one identification. And there's a reason why we should be concerned about both ends of the spectrum. We have a recent case in Canada called an investigation by the Privacy Commissioner of Canada and the Commissioners of Alberta, Quebec, and BC that all have relevant legislation into Cadillac Fairview malls and their use of facial analytics.
12 of the country's most popular shopping malls now under the microscope after a federal privacy investigation found the mall operator used tiny cameras and facial recognition technology embedded in map kiosks to estimate the ages and genders of shoppers without their knowledge.
They thought they were only collecting demographic data, or they said they were only collecting demographic data, or even that they were only collecting demographic data. They said, well, that's not really personal information. It's just, it's information about people, but it's not personal information because we're not figuring out exactly who they are. So they tried to argue that privacy law didn't really apply because our privacy laws protect personal information. And that's one of the risks of facial analytics, is that organizations may inappropriately believe that it's okay to capture your image. And let's face it, your face is a very personal thing. We all each only have one, and it's an integral part of our body. But the thing with facial analytics is people may think if we're not actually putting a name to that face, it's okay to do it. And that's one of the real risks of analytics. And hopefully the Cadillac Fairview decision from the privacy commissioners will put organizations on notice that that interpretation of private sector privacy law in particular is incorrect. The other thing is that when these kind of things happen in secret, and when consent is not obtained, there's also no public accountability for what's done with the information. And it's not true that just because we don't know what your name is, that we can't use information about you in ways that might harm you. That's where privacy and equality rights connect. So it would be one thing for the store to say, well, we really want to know if we have, a majority of people who are, let's say, over 55 shopping in our mall, because first of all, we might want to try marketing to a younger audience, but second, maybe to make those customers more comfortable in our shopping environment. We might want to install more comfy chairs down the middle of the mall. And many of us would say, oh, isn't that nice? The mall is using the information that they have to provide a more comfortable environment for their customer base. They could equally use those analytics to say, hey, after school, we've got a lot of young teenage miscreants. And hey, look at the proportion of those young people who are in our stores who are Black. Maybe we should up our security presence. And then, depending on the nature of that security presence, that could have a real impact on the way that those youth are treated in the space of the mall. Either by subjecting them to increased surveillance, because they've added more staff, security staff, or increasing the number of encounters that those young people might have with security. And that's problematic, particularly to the extent that those contexts would be grounded in sort of racist bias about who might be, a miscreant. And we know that there's, profound elements of systemic racism in policing generally and in security more broadly, that are based on false beliefs about people who are racialized. So that's an example where knowing that demographic data could actually have a consequential effect on individuals, and they'd never know why. And there wouldn't be any recourse if the data was collected in secret. So that's an example of a way in which facial analytics could still be used, even if they don't know that it's me, Brenda, or you, Tim, in the mall, that it could still be used to affect us. And the reality is it might well affect other people more than us. Facial recognition technology, when we're actually identified, raises then whole sets of different issues because it's obviously even more intrusive and opens up the floodgates in a private sector setting for individual targeted marketing, which, some people might like or hate, to individual attempts at behavioral manipulation or control.
There is also bias found in facial recognition algorithms, which then pushes the marginalized in society even further to the fringes. Could you explain this multiplier effect further for us?
Technology is never neutral. Technology fits into a political system, and it's a system where there are power imbalances between people. Particularly with facial recognition, one of the shortcomings of the technology is that it simply doesn't work as well on faces that aren't white and male. And it works the most badly on faces that are Black, and faces that are Black and female, or faces that are Black and young. It also works badly, of course, on people who are Indigenous, people whose skin is brown. Those kinds of people are already, and this is well documented, affected by systemic racism and bias in activities like policing. And there are different ways that the multiplier effect works. One of them is simply that these groups often receive disproportionate attention from police because of the bias that's built into policing. And the facial recognition technology allows that attention to be even more intrusive and particularized. So it's a technology that, using the technology, increases the level of intrusion into their lives by virtue of being subject to more surveillance than other people. But the technology, and then the fact that technology doesn't work very well for those kinds of faces, means that there's more likely to be mistakes made. So they're disproportionately going to be caught up in the surveillance gaze of those cameras and that technology. And then it's more likely that when they're disproportionately caught up, there's going to be more mistakes made about them. And all of that then it just feeds back into and exacerbates the systemic problems that we're facing when it comes to policing in particular.
Brenda, can you tell us more about the new federal legislation that is coming out shortly? And how is the concept of consent defined and defended in this legislation?
So we do have new private sector privacy legislation on the table right now. It's called Bill C-11, and there's two pieces to it, the Consumer Privacy Protection Act and then a Data Tribunal Act that's going to create a new enforcement mechanism for this new law. And it's an interesting piece of legislation. It's something that privacy advocates have been calling for more than a decade. We really desperately needed a law that was more up to date, that was designed to, at a time when we say talk about files, most of us are now talking about something on our computer rather than something locked in a cabinet. So this is a law that was, much anticipated, much needed, and it goes some but not all of the way towards fixing the problems that we were hoping it would be able to fix. One of the things it does do is maintain the concept of consent. And that wasn't a given. There's been a lot of conversation about whether or not consent can still be meaningful in the modern age. We've all downloaded an app onto our phone or our computer, and we want it. And our choice is click yes to accept all the terms and conditions, or click no and don't get the product that you want. When you click yes, you're deemed to have given consent. And buried deep in the terms of service of whatever that application is are all the things that they are claiming the right to do with your information based on the fact that you made that click. There's a real question about whether that can constitute meaningful consent. Many people would say, no, it's not meaningful if we're just clicking to make it go because it's a take it or leave it equation. So there was a big consultation before the creation of this law by the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, specifically looking at whether or not a new privacy law should remain consent-based or not. The consensus was generally that it should be, that consent is something really important because when it comes to informational privacy, one of the really important factors is the ability to have control over our own information, control over who gets to see it, what gets done with it, what uses it's allowed to be put to. And if you took consent out of the equation, it becomes very difficult to provide individuals with that control. So the new act doubled down on consent. It said consent still matters. People should still have the opportunity to consent. And it actually included some provisions from a recent set of guidelines from the Privacy Commissioner of Canada around meaningful consent. So they tried to, buff up the consent provisions in the act to make sure that the consent that is asked of people must be meaningful. But then they, in a nod to the idea that consent is hard, they also created a whole bunch of exemptions in this act, times when businesses wouldn't need to get consent. Some of those exemptions, in fact, are not just they don't need to get consent, but there are times when they can use your information without your knowledge. It's not so. There are phrases where it's use without consent or knowledge, which is deeply problematic, obviously, from the perspective of a privacy advocate. And some of those provisions are things around legitimate business purposes, which sounds okay, right? Businesses should be able to use our information for things that are legitimate, as long as what is legitimate is appropriately narrowly defined. So most of us would say, if I'm buying a product and I give you a credit card number, it's okay to use that piece of information that I've given you to process my transaction. And you shouldn't need to say explicitly, is it okay if I use this number to process the transaction? Do you consent to that use? Because by virtue of choosing to give it to you, you can assume consent. Once you get past that sort of information strictly necessary to conduct a transaction, what is or isn't a legitimate business purpose has the potential to get fuzzier. particularly because many businesses want to train AI tools to further their business, and AI needs lots of data. So there can be many legitimate reasons why, or many reasons why an organization would want to collect information that the individual may or may not consider to be a legitimate business purpose or expect to be being thought of as a legitimate business purpose. And then there's a bunch of other exemptions, a whole string of them in the law. So one of the things that CCLA and other privacy engaged folks will be doing when it comes time to do public submissions on this bill is push back against those exemptions to say they really need to be much more tightly constrained, much more tightly defined. If the exemptions are so wide that you could drive a truck through them, this law isn't serving its purpose. The other thing the law does is provide, and this has been much lauded, is it provides much stricter enforcement abilities. It provides the commissioner the ability to issue not just binding orders, but also through his interaction with the data tribunal, levy fines. This has been something that people have been calling for a while, at least some people, because we've had occasions where large multinational companies in particular who are investigated by the commissioner take a look at his non-binding recommendations and say, that's nice, but we disagree, so we're not going to do it. So the commissioner needed a stick to go along with his carrot of naming and shaming in order to make these companies fall into line.
Wow, it's somewhat shocking to hear that even the laws aren't as robust as what we may assume them to be. So what about us? What can we do to become better informed? What can we do to help shape the way this emerging technology impacts Canadians, or to make the Canadian future better?
There are things that we can do as individuals, and there are things that we can do as a society. As individuals, it's really important to become aware of the issues. Virtually every single day, there are stories being published that have privacy impacts. Stories about breaches, stories about location tracking, stories about different kinds of practices that have the potential to impinge on privacy. It's not hard to get informed about these things if you're paying attention. So the first thing to do is, if you care, pay attention. The other thing right now in particular is that we've got this beautiful policy window where we have Parliament actively considering new privacy laws, and it makes a huge difference for individuals who care to reach out to their member of Parliament and tell them what they want to see in that law. Tell them what they think is good, tell them what they think is bad, or simply say, these are the things that I want a new law to include. You can do that. Ideally, you read it, but you can do it without even reading the new piece of legislation. You just need to tell them, to some extent, that you care about the issue. Because a politician knows that for every individual, every constituent that comes to them and expresses a concern, that there are 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 more in the background who haven't taken the time to reach out to him or her. So you can actually have an impact that is disproportionate to the effort you have to put in by engaging with your political representative. The other thing is there may be an opportunity to submit comments to the parliamentary committee that's going to be studying this law. When it comes to the private sector, the other thing you can do as an individual is vote with your feet and vote with your wallet. So if you become informed through your reading that there's a company that is engaging in behavior that you think is inappropriate, that is overly privacy invasive, that is not fair, don't shop there. Don't go there. Don't give them your business. If you really want to take it the next step further, you write to the CEO and you say, you're not getting my business because your product is invading my privacy. I think that the way that your technology works is creepy. I'm not satisfied with your privacy policy. I'm not satisfied with the way that you do business. Again, very few people will ever do that, which means that the single voice that comes in saying that can potentially have an impact that's larger than what you might believe from one person. And if many people do it, of course, there's a massive impact.
Where do you see facial recognition technology taking us as humanity in the next 10 to 30 years?
That's kind of a scary question. At CCLA at the moment, what we're doing is calling for a moratorium on this technology, because we genuinely believe that the potential impacts on our rights and freedoms can be so profound that this technology has the capacity, if badly used, to be so invasive that it has the ability to shift the relationship of individuals with their communities and with the state. It's just too powerful, and there's too many things that go wrong, and right now it's simply too flawed because of the discriminatory elements. Although the reality is there, as technology evolves, it gets better. And in this case, if they fix the technology so it becomes more perfectly able to identify all of us with greater and greater accuracy, the potential for the invasiveness of it just gets worse. The potential for harm correspondingly potentially gets worse rather than better if they fix the technology. Because even if the technology is not making mistakes on faces that are Black, again, we go back to the issue of systemic racism. That means that those individuals, if they're more perfectly able to be targeted, are more perfectly able to be discriminated against in a plethora of different ways. So fixing the technology in this case is going to make it worse. We really think that it's important to actually engage in this exercise that we're doing in this question and think about, where do we want to be? What kind of society do we want to live in? What do we want the world of our children to look like in the next 10 or 30 years? And are there any ways in which this technology can be used in ways that are genuinely beneficial, either to us as individuals or to us more broadly and collectively as a society? And are there ways that are just so profoundly dangerous that we should take them off the table? After we've had those conversations, after we've had those debates and figured out those if questions, then we might well come to the conclusion that, well, you know what? Sometimes the use of facial recognition for something like authentication, maybe that's okay. And there I'm thinking about, if I'm going to use my face to unlock my phone, and my facial template is stored on my device, and I control it, and it's not shared with anybody else, and it provides me with a simple and easy way that is secure to access a personal device, that might be a use where we say, okay, so there's a lot of individual benefit there, and there are appropriate sort of technical ways to make sure that is a use that can be safe. There might be other uses that have to do not with authentication, but with individual identification or categorization, where the social risks get much more profound. And those are the sort of the use cases where we need to decide, are there ways that we can create the right set of rules and regulations and restrictions and safeguards to try and ensure that the technology provides public benefit in a way that's proportionate to the risk, and that we've got the right accountability framework in place to make sure that that is always happening for public good and not for harm. If we can figure out what those safeguards are and what those applications are, then maybe we go there. And as I said, then there's probably a category of uses for the technology that should be simply off the table. And here I'm thinking about things like Clearview AI facial recognition, where we just had a big report from a joint study of privacy commissioners, and they looked at this facial recognition technology from an American startup company that scraped more than 3 billion images of people from sites across the internet, many of them against the terms of service of those sites. And we've got a report from the commissioner that says how they collected the images was illegal. The purpose for which they collected the images was not an appropriate purpose under the law. It was not one that individuals would reasonably expect that images that they posted of themselves or others online would end up subjecting them to be present in a perpetual police lineup that was used by police forces around the world. that in fact what that was fundamentally was a form of mass surveillance that was not justified in a democracy. And there are going to be other applications like Clearview AI that we might reasonably come to the conclusion they are not justified in a democracy. If we have those hard conversations, if we figure out what uses of the technology are and are not appropriate in a society that values freedom, then maybe in 10 or 30 years, we'll have some cool tools that do good and that we feel safe and comfortable being allowed to use. And we'll have some tools that we're comfortable knowing we have decided are never going to be implemented. If we don't have those conversations, and if we don't engage in that sort of legislative and first, ethical, rights-based exercise followed by careful legislative and policy formulation, then we could have a society where every time we take a step out our front door, there will be cameras and the capacity will be there for us to be recognized. This technology, taken to its fullest extent and allowed to proliferate without regulation or safeguards, has the capacity to annihilate anonymity and personal privacy in public spaces or quasi-public spaces, has the capacity to fundamentally change the nature of the world that we live in. And that sounds hyperbolic and it sounds dystopian, it sounds exaggerated, but it's not. And that's frightening and kind of sad. But also reality. There are some technologies. This technology is not neutral. This technology grants power to those who are able to control it. And that power could be used to harm individuals, both because of the way the technology works and the nature of society and the things that can happen if we become perfectly identifiable to sort of anybody who wants to figure out who we are. And you can brainstorm the kinds of scenarios that could happen. Everything from stalking to policing to simply never being unwatched, never being unknown, never being able to sort of take a free breath and make a really stupid, distasteful joke to a friend without that being somewhere recorded and registered and have the potential to come back at you. That's a surveillance society that we probably don't want to live in. And right now is sort of the policy moment where we have to make the choices that will determine whether we can avoid it or whether we start slowly slipping towards it. Because it won't happen all at once. It'll happen in teeny incremental pieces that we won't notice until we get there. And by the time we get there, it'll be too late. One of the ways that we fix this, that we make sure that the future we get is the one that we want, is by starting these conversations, by thinking through the issues, by agreeing or disagreeing or debating or arguing, but eventually sort of coming to some sort of consensus. And again, it's about technology that serves us rather than technology that we will eventually serve.